Welcome to Mexico Matters, the CSIS podcast about how events occurring in Mexico can impact and, more importantly, matter in the United States. I am Mariana, non-resident senior associate of the Americas program at CSIS and the former CEO of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, COMEXI. The United States will soon have a new president. And whoever sits in the White House will shape not only the issues that are so important for the American public, but his or her decisions will also impact all of us around the world. To explain why this is such an important election and talk to us about the state of U.S. politics, about what can be expected from either President Trump or President Harris, that it is truly my pleasure to welcome Alan Stoga, chairman of the Tallberg Foundation. Alan is also the host of a wonderful podcast called The New Thinking for a New World, a longtime consultant to a wide range of Latin American corporate and government clients, and I must add also my former boss. Alan Stoga, welcome to Mexico Matters. I mean, you cannot imagine what a pleasure it is for me to have you on the show and to see you again. We haven't seen each other for a long time. So it is truly a pleasure to be with you and to have this conversation about the U.S. election and how will that impact Mexico.
Mariana, I'm delighted to be here. You're one of my favorite podcasters, and CSIS is one of my favorite places. And in fact, I actually do believe, as I know you know, that Mexico does matter.
Yes, unfortunately, most people say Mexico doesn't matter, but that's another conversation.
Next time,
exactly. Well, Alan, truly welcome, particularly because we're certainly living in interesting times and the world is changing rapidly. Whoever sits in the White House will have to make a lot of important decisions, right? Sort of how to coexist with China, how to manage the ongoing wars, how to approach trade, how to work with your alliances and your allies, the environment, other security concerns. I mean, you name it. And all of those decisions will certainly impact all of us around the world. And everybody says that this election is the most important election in our lifetimes. What do you think? Is this really the most important election in our lifetimes? And if so, why? Or is it only that, like in every other election, candidates just tell us that this is really the most important one to get us out to vote?
What's different about this election, Mariana, is not that long list of things going wrong in the world, because it's an even longer list. And whomever is in Washington as president always matters. And in as a fraught environment as we're living in now, the next president after that is going to matter enormously. But that's not what people mean when they say this is the most important election. This has become a referendum, in a sense, on democracy, weirdly, for both sides of the political aisle. The Democrats, Kamala Harris's closing statement was about Trump as Hitler, the end of democracy, there'll never be another election, all of which is, I'm not sure you can use this word, crap. Donald Trump, on the other hand, more or less says the same thing about her, that if she's elected, your voices won't be heard. They'll just do what they want to do. They weaponize the Department of Justice, et cetera, et cetera. So the issue on this election wasn't on the list of things, although all of those is what the election should be about. Both sides in this zero-sum game of politics, as it's now evolved, have defined this election as being about my version of democracy versus your version of democracy, which feeds immediately into this intense partisanship of the United States, which feeds in turn into both the hysteria and the violence that both characterize American politics today. Both sides are guilty of having transformed what ought to be an important, perhaps the most important election in my lifetime, into the most ridiculous election of my lifetime. Over this set of red herrings, my democracy versus your democracy.
Alan, help us understand something. Are these two narratives, fascism or the fear of fascism on one side and, I don't know, corruption on the other, do they really resonate with the American public at large? Or is it just the extreme Democrats talking to themselves and the MAGA Republicans doing the same?
I would frame it somewhat differently. I would distinguish between politicians and their worldview on the one hand, and the body politic and their worldview on the other hand. What you said about extremes, right, left, Republican, Democrat, is true primarily about politicians. They have defined, for all sorts of reasons, politics, as I said earlier, as a zero-sum game, a game of extremes where the center is toxic. Nobody wants to appeal to the center. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you want to appeal to the extremes because that's where the professional politicians in this country live. Every single poll done by everybody on all the issues says that the American voter, overwhelmingly, not 50%, something like 80%, maybe 90%, don't care about those kinds of political cult issues, whether they be left or right. What they care about is economics. They care about stability and security. They are deeply worried about the border. Both parties, by the way, both kinds of voters. They are completely separated from what's going on outside the United States. They don't care about Ukraine. They don't care about the Middle East. They don't care about Russia. They don't care about China. It is the economy, stupid. Always has been, always will be for them. The irony of this separation, which is wider than it's ever been in my lifetime, between how the politicians look at the world and how voters look at the world, produce this massive confusion about Republicans being they're all this way and Democrats are all that way. Fact of the matter is, I have never in my life met someone who walked up to me and said, "Hi, Alan, I'm a Republican." It just doesn't happen. Parties don't matter to Americans. You actually own less than 2/3. In fact, now it's less than 60% of Americans identify with one party or the other. 40% of Americans say they're, quote, independent, unquote. And even those who say they're Democrat or Republican, unlike a laborite in England or somebody from the FDP in Germany, they don't have a card in their pocket that says, "I'm a member of this party." There's no dues. There's no party membership. There's nothing unless you're a professional politician. And the only way you can get paid is to be a professional Republican or a professional Democrat. So I think we need to separate the frames between people and politics. And that distinction, that gap, has never been wider and is incredibly dangerous. That's what's dangerous of democracy, is the gap between the people and the politicians. That's where democracy disappears.
If, as you say, the American people are not going to base their vote on which candidate will be better at dealing with all the issues going on in the world, and they're not really as focused on this political discourse, but rather they care about the economy. As you say, it's the economy, stupid. Then let me ask you this. Which of the two candidates do you believe will be better for the American economy?
Before I answer your question, let me go back and add a couple of things. American people, in the main, think politicians are corrupt. That's true whether they tend to vote Republican or Democrat, whether they're independent, whatever they are, they think politicians are corrupt. Secondly, they don't trust politicians. They don't trust anybody, but they particularly don't trust politicians. At the moment, there's sort of a race to the bottom between whether you trust the media or politicians less, but you don't trust any of them. That's part of this gap. It's part of the consequences of what I talked about a moment ago. The other caveat is that in terms of issues, yes, it's economics overwhelmingly. Abortion is a terribly important issue. Something like 14%, 15% of Americans, if you ask them and say, what's the single most important issue, they would tell you it's abortion and access to abortion.
In all states, or would you say that in the state?
That's a national number. It varies by state for sure. And what you do about it varies by state, but that's a national number. But it's important to note that if you look at the economy, whether the inflation aspect of the economy or the growth aspect of the economy, 30% of voters will tell you that that's the most important. If they have to say one single issue, that's the most important issue. So it isn't that there aren't issues other than economics. And indeed, immigration, which is also an economic issue.
It's the second most important issue, right?
Depends which poll you look at. It's either abortion or immigration. They flip. They're both around the same 13, 14%. If you choose one, not one of these polls list everything that you care about, which, by the way, is the only way that Ukraine gets on the list. And it comes in at sort of 1% or something. There are issues that are important to people. They tend to be economics. They tend to be abortion. They tend to be immigration. And those may influence how they vote, although that's not at all clear, partly because the two presidential candidates have been all over every aspect of every issue. So really saying, well, this president would do this or that president would do that is almost impossible. Now, you asked about the economy and what the presidents would do. In one sense, it's an impossible question to answer. On the Democratic side, you have a candidate who has zero experience and zero track record. It is unknowable what she would do about the economy. Whatever they've said in the last month may well be new news to her because she's never...
Yeah, she hasn't really said anything about it. Yeah.
Not really. She's never said anything about it. It's not been her job. She's never been involved in economic policy at any level of government. So when you read or when you hear experts saying, well, Kamala Harris government would do this, this, and this, what you ought to ask is, how do you know?
Those people saying, Kamala will do this and this, isn't it because she hasn't said how she would be different than President Biden?
She's actually on record as having said, I'll do the same things Biden did. And the issue, let me boil it down. The issue is very simple. Will she be Obama 3 or Biden 2? There is a tiny, tiny, tiny chance she would be Harris 1, but that's the Manchurian candidate aspect of it. We have no idea who she really is. But will she be more like a continuation of Obama's policies or more like a continuation of Biden's policies? And those are really different strategies. They were different in economics. They were different in foreign policy. They were different, God knows, they were different vis-a-vis Mexico and immigration. So the judgment voters and everybody else in the world have to make is, who is Kamala Harris? And if we can't imagine who she is because she's given us almost no clues in policy terms, then we're going to guess she's either another Obama continuation or another Biden continuation. And the final point there is, with whom would she govern? Everybody's bet in Washington, as you well know, is that she's going to staff her government from the residue of the old Obama types or from some of the Biden types. And it's the mix of people that would partially determine what she would do for the economy. On the Trump side, I have a very unpopular view. He's already been president. We know what he's going to do. He's going to do the same thing he did last time. And all of this imagination that, he'll do this, he'll do that. No, he's going to be, totally different, good, bad, or ugly.
Yeah, we have a track record.
I don't judge people based on my guess of what they're thinking that they may someday become. I make my judgment based on what we know. And in that regard, if you put aside things like the Penn model, everybody's trying to model the economy for both of them based on this nonsense that I've been describing. All that said, if you're a betting woman, you probably got to bet that a Harris government would raise taxes and dramatically raise spending, which is the inheritance that we think she reflects. And you've got to bet that a Trump government would cut taxes, although I got a tax raise personally from Donald Trump, contrary to the supposed notion that there was a huge tax cut. In fact, government revenues went up under Trump. They didn't go down. So this tax cut stuff needs to be seen holistically, not individually. That he will not spend dramatically more, although he did last time, but he would cut taxes. Net, you probably get more economic stimulus in the short run from a Trump government. You probably get, as was the case with the Biden government, stimulus further out, a lot of industrial policy out of a Harris government, a lot of deregulation out of a Trump government. Net, net, net. If you're a betting woman, I think you bet that American deficits, fiscal deficits, continue to rise dramatically over the next 4 years, that you get more inflation out of both presidents, you get a little more growth out of a Trump than out of a Harris in the short run, and you muck around in both cases a lot with trade policy. The days, just one point on trade, they're both protectionist. This notion that one's protectionist and the other is a free trader is just garbage. There's nothing, I haven't yet I've not seen a free trader in Washington in years. So in one sense, it's not going to matter. It's more or less of something. But what we know we won't get more of is a lot of free trade. We won't get more free trade agreements under a Harris government than under a Trump government. We'll get to USMCA in a while. But again, those are guesses, 100% guesses in one case, and maybe 50% guesses in the other case.
Before we go deeper into trade policies, Alan, let me ask you one question. I mean, I was there in 2016 when you told a big group of people that you thought, and you presented the case, that Donald Trump was going to be the next president of the United States. Are you making any predictions this time around?
I have a $5 bet with some friends that Trump will win the Electoral College. But I want to make an important caveat. Every poll, everything I can find anywhere says they are as tied can be. We have never seen an election this close, certainly not in the modern era. Anybody who tells you, I know this is going to happen, I would worry about it. And it's not just the national polling that's tied. It is the swing state, the 7 swing state polling is tied, almost all of it within the margin of error in terms of reputable polls. This is like a horse race where they're in the last bit of the race. They literally are neck to neck, and maybe one will be able to stretch her nose a little further than the other, but we've never seen anything like this. The question becomes those 7 swing states, and within those 7 swing states, the tiny few number of people left undecided. So there are about 165 million voters in the United States, give or take some. If you believe the undecided numbers in the 7 swing states, something between 3 and 4% of those 7 states, voters are undecided. And if they decide to vote, so you don't know that they're voting, but let's assume they're the undecideds who say they're going to vote are going to vote, that's about 1.25 million people. So something like 1 million votes are going to decide this election. And guessing how those people, how they're voting, because remember, we've been voting for weeks already. Most people don't understand that approximately half of Americans will have voted by the time we get to election day. Parentheses, we have no idea. This is, again, one of those distinctions between how reality and people actually look at the world and how politicians look at the world. So politicians are running around saying, election day is important. What happens on Tuesday matters. How you vote on Tuesday matters. Yeah, it's true, except half of the nation will have already voted. 95% of Californians vote by mail. 95% of the state that's the 7th largest economy in the world. So do they care about next Tuesday? What inputs do they have? What did any of them hear about before they voted? The Kamala's closing argument.
Yeah, the closing
the big
statement.
Madison Square Garden rally. All of that stuff is still the old school, let's pretend everybody votes on Tuesday, yet they don't. So the point of all that, Mariana, is that it's tied. There is no crystal ball. The reason my bet is only $5 is because, and it's not made in front of a large room of people this time. I also got 2020 right.
A lot of people will hopefully hear about your bet.
Well, the bet is only $5, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure I would place too much bet on my bet. I'm only willing to wager $5.
Alan, I have heard people, and I have seen it in some polls, that they have a scenario in which you have a divided government. That is, the president is from one party and you have Congress or the Senate from another party. How likely do you think is that scenario?
That's not what the betting odds are saying today. The betting odds today are saying that there's a 65-35 chance that Trump wins, saying that there's a 54-46 odds, that 54 to 46 betting odds, that the Republicans hold the House, and an 84-16 odds that they win the Senate. So the betting odds today, a week before more or less the election, are that if you have unified government, it's more likely to be under the Republicans than under the Democrats. The models at the moment have probably the best electoral model running is done by the 538 people. They've got odds of winning the presidency, 52 to 48 for Trump. The odds of winning the House, 52-48 to the Republicans. And the odds of winning the Senate, 89-11. All of that done with 1,000 runs of their model. So it's not that the Democrats couldn't win. It's that what seems to be happening, and it's reflected in certainly the state polling, back in that horse race, the Republican horse looks like it's starting to stretch in the way that a runner or a horse stretches for the finish line a little bit more. So the possibility of unified government, for worse, I think, by the way, exists more on the Republican side than the Democratic side. But in any event, neither President Harris or a President Trump will try to govern with the other side. Quite the opposite. They will try to govern in spite of the other side. We don't have in our political DNA anymore this reach across the aisle stuff that we imagined was the past. Nobody's going to do it.
And how much can the presidency do in
almost
action?
Everything?
Right.
Almost everything. We have allowed over the last several decades, we've allowed the creation of what was called back in the 60s, the imperial presidency. The president's power today compared to that imperial presidency idea is dramatically greater. The last time we declared war under the Constitution was literally in 1942. And that wasn't again, we'd already declared war against the Germans and Japanese and Italians. We had to add the Romanians and a couple others because they had joined the Axis. So we don't bother with the Constitution when it comes to declaring war. We have given the president almost unilateral economic policy in a whole series of spaces. Sanctions. The whole world worries about American sanctions. Most of those sanctions rest on a law from 1976 that was created during the oil crisis. And we don't bother with new laws for new sanctions. We just lay on this using the International Economic Emergency Powers Act to do things. The current president of the United States, Joe Biden, went to Europe a couple of weeks ago and signed a 10-year agreement with the Ukrainians, a 10-year security agreement with the Ukrainians. Didn't ask the Congress, didn't ask the American people. Senate never passed anything, but he signed it. Back when Trump was president, he cut the deal with the Taliban to leave Afghanistan, or cut with the Afghan government that he was going to leave Afghanistan. No Congress was ever asked for that. So the power of the presidency is, to use a word I hate, awesome. There is no other elected office on the planet Earth like it. In fact, I would argue, I'm not sure the American president doesn't have more personal power than either the Russian or the Chinese.
But if that is the case,
which will get in trouble for saying that, because although now the Democrats are going to scream at me, oh, no, you don't understand. They're dictators.
Let me follow up on that and take the example you just mentioned. Biden signing a security agreement with Ukraine. Isn't the problem with that whomever is the next president can just throw it out the window? And because Congress didn't really pass it, there is no certainty on the permanence of that particular policy. Am I right?
Well, it has the power of law, but it has the problem you just pointed to. In the good old days of not that long ago, the complaint about American elections from many voters was it didn't matter for whom I voted. If I voted for X or Y, they do the same damn thing. So, and that was, in a sense, a positive thing because the policy alternatives were relatively narrow. Yes, it did, in fact, matter whether a Democrat won or a Republican won, but it was a bit like a bowling lane where they put the bumpers in the alleys. So you're going to hit something. And you're not
going to move that far.
You wouldn't move that far. That's all gone. And it started going, one can debate. There's a huge debate over when it started, when that sort of consensus around policy began to fracture. Was it Reagan? Was it Carter? But it's been going on for a long time. And each president has widened the gap so that the first thing any modern president does when he comes into office that first day, he signs a whole bunch of executive orders undoing the executive orders of his predecessor. And every president of the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 have done exactly that. So too would President Harris or President Trump. They'd have this big signing day where they're getting rid of all this stuff that's cluttering up. The other thing that happens is that you fire everybody. When I was in the U.S. government way back in the 70s, the number of people who actually left at the end of administration was relatively few. It was the cabinet, the sub-cabinet, even political appointees, technically political appointees, deputy assistant secretaries, many of them stayed administration to administration, a bit like a European career service. That has changed over time, and that did start with the Reagan government. And every president since then, Harris would do the same thing, and Trump would do the same thing. They want their people running the government. And so they appoint thousands and thousands and thousands of new executives. Imagine running a company where the day you take it over, you fire everybody down to the office director. It would collapse. The punchline here is simply this. That is what has created the volatility, that entire collection of things has created this enormous volatility that has made America unpredictable to the rest of the world and frankly unpredictable to us.
There seems to be, Alan, two things in which both sides agree. One, as you mentioned, is that we don't like trade agreements anymore, right? Sort of they're both, or there have both been protectionist. I mean, Trump, he recently said that tariffs was one of his favorite words in the world. And that he also said that if elected, he was going to raise the tariffs on China and put a 10% tariff on Mexico and Canada. I mean, given the interlinkages that exist between North America, we're not only trading together, we actually build together, right? So if we have supply chains in which, for example, an automobile crosses the border back and forth 7 times, 12 times, and it receives input from the different countries. How likely is it that if Trump gets elected, that he would actually impose those tariffs in North America?
Let's go there first. As you know, and as I'm sure most of your audience knows, the USMCA was signed in 2018, took effect in 2020, and could potentially be renegotiated or at least reviewed in 2026. That's at the option of each of the 3 signatories. If I'm a betting man, I would bet it's going to be up for renegotiation, regardless of who becomes the next president of the United States. The question becomes, what would Trump want if he were president? What would Harris want if she were president? When it comes to Trump, it's a known. Trump will be very unhappy with the bilateral deficit, as he was 10 years ago, and he will insist on some measures that perhaps, maybe, who knows, ought to reduce that deficit. If Mexico's smart, they'll give him something, but not very much, but it'll look like a lot, and the deficit gets. Will he have many concerns beyond that? He'll have a China concern, for sure, and whether that's in the context of USMCA or outside the context of USMCA is a good question. He will have a nearshoring consideration, as he did last time. And I should have said this earlier. The thing, though, about Trump is you always got to look at what he does, not what he says. This is a man who talks endlessly, says all sorts of outrageous things, partly to sound outrageous. He's very, very good at whipping up audiences. So he'll say all sorts of things. But what he did with USMCA last time, I suspect is what he'd do this time. Harris, again, is a known unknown. But in that context, what we know about what Obama wanted, what Biden has done, and what a big chunk of the professional Democratic Party, the office holders that would show up probably, is that they would not at all be focused on the bilateral deficit because that's bad economics, but they would be intensely focused on labor standards, on environmental standards, on social standards, on policy standards. And the notion of a renegotiated USMCA under a Harris government, I would think would terrify Mexico, because everything you don't like about the Mexicans don't like about U.S. intervention in your country will come out in a Harris government. As we saw with what Biden did in the subsidies that were given out during the CHIPS Act and the IRA, as we saw during the Obama renegotiations with Mexico, you'd see a much more interventionist, let's level the playing field for the workers. Most of those workers now vote Republican, but that's a different point.
Who do you think will be better in enforcing the law? And by that, I also mean enforcing the USMCA trade agreement. I mean, one thing we do know is that Trump back then made very credible threats and people believed him. So far, Biden has been awful in enforcing compliance with USMCA. And as you know, Mexico has been discriminating against energy investors, destroying institutional independence, among many other violations. What do you make of this?
I think you've got to separate several strands. You've got to separate the migration strand from the trade strand. But the overarching point is that, and this is going to sound harsh, deliberately so, the Biden government has simply been on issue after issue after issue incompetent. It isn't blind eye. It's that they're just not very good. They haven't changed immigration policy. They just haven't enforced it. They haven't changed trade policy. They just haven't enforced it. And issue after issue, it's been incompetence, not change in policy.
So it's not by design, basically.
Oh, it's very much not by design. It's just they're not very good at what they do. I'm not going to argue the Trump government was very good at what it did, but in some cases, their priorities demand that they act on them. But think back to the wall. How many millions and millions of conversations occurred over the wall? That wall which never got built, right? That even the parts that got built are irrelevant. But everybody hyperventilated and bloviated over the wall. And oh my God, they're going to make us pay for it. They're words, and words for politicians, especially American politicians, are not cheap. They're free. So look at what they do. So your question is an excellent one. Which government is more likely to enforce the law when it comes to the border? And whether that border be with regard to people or products. And I think, again, if you're a betting woman, you're going to probably bet that a Democratic government under Kamala Harris would be more like a Biden government and not be able to enforce the law than a Republican government under President Trump that, at least for certain kinds of hot button issues to them and their constituents, migration being one of them and trade being another one, there's a higher likelihood that they would enforce the law. Not that I think they will be dramatically more competent. I don't think they'll be dramatically more competent. In fact, I think they'll probably be even less competent. But they will focus and get some things done, I think, of the kinds of things that if I were Claudia Sheinbaum, I'd be concerned. I'd much rather have a Biden approach, well, it doesn't really matter, than a Trump approach, even pounding on the table. Although I think the difference between AMLO and Sheinbaum on this issue, AMLO understood, don't listen to him. He just talks. And he was able to just ignore all that.
And it was a transactional relationship.
That is the most important word you can use with Donald Trump. The reason why, if I were president of Mexico, I'd much prefer Donald Trump to Kamala Harris is because you can do a deal with him. AMLO proved it. AMLO did better than any other head of government in the world managing the relationship with Donald Trump. And that's not because AMLO was particularly brilliant. It's that he understood the guy and understands the transactional nature of his brain and wears headphones. He doesn't listen to all this nonsense.
With all the changes occurring in Mexico, and by this I mean the new judicial reform, the reversal of the energy reforms, the electricity laws, the removal of the regulatory bodies, and many other USMCA violations, do you think the next U.S. president will continue to see Mexico as a North American partner, or just turn around and let Mexico continue on this less reliable trajectory? How will the next president approach North America and Mexico?
I don't think Mexico in reality has ever been considered a partner in the sense that you just set it up. I can imagine very, very, very few policies that were made one way instead of another way because of consideration or concern for Mexico. That's not how the United States works. It's never worked that way. it will never work that way. That's not to say that Mexico, in contrast to the title of your podcast, doesn't matter. It's to say that what matters in the way any country makes its policies is its own national interest.
Right. But there was the notion that as part of the U.S. national interest, Mexico played a role, right? Sort of.
But lots of countries play roles. And no country, as you know, I've argued for decades that Mexico is the United States' most important foreign policy issue because of the border. It's the nature of borders. Canada is trying to get in the game, and because of the way it's treating its border, which is a different issue, which we're not going to have time to talk about today. So Mexico matters for sure. Doesn't matter in the sense that Mexicans would like it to matter. That is to say, we, the United States, are going to make policy in deference to Mexico. Not going to happen. But that's different from saying, will the United States continue to have preferential policies that favor Mexico vis-a-vis third, fourth, and fifth countries because it's in the American national interest? Absolutely, of course. So USMCA or something like it, it'll come up with yet another, a more stupid name. NAFTA was a great name. USMCA does not come trippingly off the tongue, nor will its successor, if we choose to rename it. That there's always going to be a special set of issues demanded by the border. First point. The second point is, I would strongly argue, in contrast to most people in Washington, it's none of our damn business how Mexico organizes its judiciary. It's none of our damn business how Mexico polices itself. It's none of our damn business whether or not Pemex is a public entity or a private entity, blah, 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 blah.
Only when it impacts U.S. investments.
If an existing investment has been made under a certain set of laws, then indeed, of course. And that's true whether it's Saudi Arabia or Mexico. Doesn't matter. But no one gave the United States the authority to say, this is how you ought to run your country. And a better example is the judiciary. By what right does an American ambassador stand up and criticize a legislature for making a decision that judges should be elected? I just voted in New York because I voted by mail, and I voted for a bunch of judges. The New York State Supreme Court is all elected. Why is it okay for us, but not okay for Mexico? And an ambassador can get up and criticize, having cleared it with his boss, that this is not in American interest. Really? So part of the problem, and this is Mexico's problem, because Mexico's never, other than AMLO, and maybe Carlos Salinas, understood how to say no to the Americans, how to define its own national interest. And to finish this particular part of my rant, I think Claudia Sheinbaum's biggest problem is she should already know how she intends to renegotiate USMCA. Because the typical Mexican approach is wait for the Americans to make a proposal and then respond. Dumb negotiating strategy.
Yeah, which takes me to, maybe it's going to be our last question, but what should be Mexico's strategy vis-a-vis USMCA and vis-a-vis China, which we really haven't talked about? And it's important. I mean, the United States doesn't want to allow China to use it as the backdoor to the United States. And, that is an issue important for both Republicans and Democrats. How do you see it?
In one sense, this is the easiest question you've asked, because the question is, what is in Mexico's national interest? Is it in its interest to have a robust trading, investment, and other relationship with China or with the United States?
But do you have to choose?
You absolutely have to choose. There is no choice about choosing. And in fact, I think it's an easy choice for Mexico because geography matters. That's why they call it geopolitics, not just politics. So I've never understood.
Well, geography and the size of the U.S. economy, right?
I've never understood why it's even an issue. I thought, and I remember telling a Secretary of Hacienda that his negotiation with Huawei was a really, really, really bad idea and was going to boomerang on Mexico. And by the way, I was proven right. His response, by the way, was, well, but we're just like the UK and they can deal with Huawei and so can we. And I confess, you just laughed. I laughed at him when he told me that. Because no, geography matters, relationships matter, national interests matter. So the answer to your negotiation question vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis the United States is Mexico has to figure out what is its national interest, what does it want, and how's it going to get it. That doesn't mean you don't have a relationship with China. The United States has a relationship with China. Why can't Mexico? It does mean that in sensitive sectors, it's a really bad idea. And those sensitive sectors cover things.
Should be well defined.
Well, unfortunately, because of the change of technology, it's hard to define them. It's getting harder and harder to define them. But if China invests in a hotel in Mexico, does anybody care? No. If China invests in the telephone backbone of China, which is intimately linked to the American backbone.
What about autos?
If you mean electric autos.
Electric, yes. BYD, for example.
That is a problem. And it's a bigger problem under Trump. Who's Trump's biggest financial supporter? Probably someone who has a deep interest in Tesla. And that's just practical politics. Moreover, we will be one of the last adopters in big scale of electric vehicles for all sorts of reasons. But the point about that is, Mariana, is that Mexico's a big country. It's an important country. It's got to start making decisions like a big, important country. I'm a big fan of AMLO because he did that. There's a lot of reasons to criticize AMLO. I got that. But in terms of the bilateral relationship, I think he managed it better than most of his predecessors, as I already said, perhaps other than Carlos Salinas, but certainly in that same category. So the challenge now for Mexico going forward is Mexico doesn't get a vote. One of these two people will win. Doesn't get a vote in the House or the Senate either. And it's not a question. A journalist asked me the other day whether the United States and Mexico are friends. And I very politely said it was the dumbest question I've ever been asked, because it's not about friends. It's about geography. It's about national interest. And it's about managing the relationship in a way that optimizes what Mexico gets out of it.
And interest.
Unfortunately, that's rarely been the approach the Mexican government has taken. But you can always start. There's always time to start a new good habit. And that would be a new good
approach.
Habit.
Yeah.
Going to be bumpy. Going to be bumpy because the American economy will be okay, which is what Mexico really cares about. But American politics is going to be even messier. Look, half of the nation is going to be very unhappy with whomever wins. And the other half will be very happy. We've now brought God into it. We actually had Kamala Harris talking about God. When Republicans talk about God, you say, okay, yeah. We get it. When Democrats start talking about God, you know you're now in a place that
you don't want to continue that rabbit hole. Yeah.
I don't know if this is our most important election, but I know I am more worried than I've ever been in my lifetime about what happens next, regardless of who wins. I think we are in a downward spiral that is very difficult to arrest. Now, that said, I'd rather have our cards in this global game of poker than anybody else's. Everybody else is in deeper trouble than we are.
In this world.
We could manage our way out of this, but I don't think we will.
Yet, despite all this nastiness in politics and the messiness that we are likely to see in the near future, the United States actually manages to keep the economy quite separate from all of this mess. I mean, look at it. The economy, it's a powerhouse, the biggest and most dynamic economy in the world. You are innovative. You have an amazing entrepreneurial ecosystem. You are a job-making machine, creating opportunities for millions. I mean, it is no surprise that you keep attracting millions and millions of people from around the world that want to come, live, and work in America.
There's a reason why so many people try to get into the United States, both in legal ways and in less than legal ways. And why nobody tries to get into China. Nobody tries to get into Russia. People try to get into Europe, but that's all, again, all relative. We do a lot of things right in the United States. We can worry about the stuff we worry about because we're so successful. These are luxury goods. We're fat, dumb, and not very happy as a nation, but we can afford to be not very happy because we are so fat. We are so prosperous. We worry about things that, God, people in Nigeria would love to have to worry about. You really care about whether this transgender swimmer can or cannot compete in this.
Something to
you worry
eat.
about pronouns. Those are luxury goods. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. I mean it in, it's wonderful how much we've accomplished. Can we do better? Yes. Blah, blah, blah. But will we do better? I'm less. I go back to my negative note. I'm a little concerned about the direction of almost everything. But I'd still rather be us than anybody else.
Alan, thank you so much for this certainly very interesting conversation. And please come back to Mexico Matters. It is always a pleasure to see you and always a pleasure to talk to you.
Do I get to ask a last question?
Go ahead.
Who do you think is going to win the presidency?
I think Kamala Harris is going to win the presidency by a very, not only the popular vote, the Electoral College. And I think Senate will go to the Republicans.
So do you want to join my $5 bet?
Let's do a bet. Let's bet $5.
There we go.
You'll invite me coffee next time we see each other.
I won't have to because I'm going to win.
Well, I'll invite you then.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it too. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog